going on 15 years now, interrupted, unfortunately, by the pandemic. So this is the first time I've been back since 2019. But my family and I are very fond of it here. And the material that I want to share this evening is controversial about companies being caught in what is a fast-changing political landscape. And some of this stuff is the sort of material that can get you canceled by your students if you take the wrong, just the opening remarks. Increasingly, professors are self-censoring themselves or being, put upon by their students when they take unpopular points of view. In this case, I already have a ticket out of town next Wednesday. So one way or the other, I'll be leaving in 9 days. But I teach a course back in New York on corporate restructuring and governance, where I think some of this material is going to need to be built into the lectures this fall. So the title slide, you can see an image that many of you may recognize. This is from an Instagram video that was launched, I think, by mid-level marketing staff at Anheuser-Busch. So this is Dylan Mulvaney, a transgender influencer who has 10 million followers online and doesn't really fit the profile of a typical Bud Light drinker who would be often a middle-aged male from the Midwest of perhaps conservative background. And they gave her a spot as a spokesperson, I think one of very many people who they put out on Instagram. And what they didn't expect was the backlash. And I don't want to spend too much time on this one example, but Donald Trump Jr. and many other people from the culture wars jumped on this video, organized a boycott of Bud Light, and the company didn't exactly ride to her rescue. They kind of let her out, hung out to dry in a way that made everybody angry. Both the left and the right were very unsatisfied. And the upshot is that after about 50 years as the leading brand in the U.S. beer market, they've lost the position to a Mexican beer, Modelo, which is not exactly what they were trying to achieve. The other, I think, destined to become an iconic corporate confrontation has been unfolding and continues to unfold at Disney, which for many years has been the largest employer in the state of Florida and has built big presence in Orlando and attracted many other people to come to Florida. And Florida now has a conservative governor who is running for president. And he passed a bill, or he had the legislature take up a bill in March that would prohibit the discussion of gay lifestyles and prohibit teachers. It was a very vague law. It was really not clear what you were and were not allowed to say, but this became known as the Don't Say Gay bill because faculty in middle schools and high schools weren't supposed to take questions about this and talk about it. Many people were upset by this bill, and people went to the Disney CEO and said, aren't you going to do something about this? And what he probably should have done is work behind the scenes before the bill hit the floor of the lead. This is something that you have lines of communication, you preempt, but this is, Bob Chapek himself is a Midwestern middle-aged male of somewhat, he's like in the last slide, someone completely unaware of what was happening. And he called DeSantis really well past the date that he should have to express the company's disappointment and concern. And this was just fuel for the fire. So what DeSantis did was rescind a special development district that Disney had been given in the 1970s and had been the home of all their theme parks in Orlando, and still is. The board of Disney then fired the CEO and brought back his predecessor, who cleverly engineered a secret board meeting to renew the privileges that DeSantis thought he had rescinded. This is all now before the courts, but here's the Disney stock price compared to the S&P 500. And both during the affairs of the Just Say Gay moment, but even when they bring back the new CEO, this has been an absolute disaster for the company. I mean, this is a classic case of mismanagement and reading the room the wrong way. So what has changed is that the right wing has gotten involved in corporate politics in a way that is completely unfamiliar And I've been having conversations about things that have gone on recently in Australia, in the UK, heard about Nigel Farage and his situation with his bank account and so forth, where essentially after decades of engagement with the political left, you're now hearing from the other side in a way that corporations are totally unprepared for and are acting like fish out of water. My own reaction to this is, what took them so long? And I want to go through a little bit of the history, but I think the political left has almost monopolized the channel of corporate shareholder protest and so forth, often with great effect. And the political right, which is very good at organizing around issues like gun ownership and ending abortion and so forth, for whatever reason ignored this channel until very recently. And now that they've got their foot in the door, I think the game has forever changed in a way that is going to make the jobs of corporate directors and managers much more challenging. So here's one more example. It's become very important to talk about the energy transition and the idea that companies shouldn't just be drilling for oil, but should be developing renewable energy. And I think everyone's aware of this in the room, but in Texas, this is a hard sell, and in certain other oil drilling states in the US. And so you're now seeing the state legislature saying, not only should we talk about the other side of the story, but in fact, banks that lend money to renewable energy companies can't do business with the state anymore. And all sorts of regulations that are forcing companies really to pick between one side or the other. You can't really play both sides of the street in this. And this not only shrinks your market, but again, forces the managers to draw upon skills that they really don't have. So I want to focus especially on the annual shareholder meetings, what are known in this country as the AGMs, where you can see the headline that there are now right-wing cultural warriors targeting these meetings. And I must say that there's a long tradition of left-wing cultural warriors who have made long careers out of doing this, have gotten quite good at it. And in fact, you can almost read the scripture that after years of criticizing progressives, right-wing and ideologues and groups are embracing the same strategy themselves. And in particular, in the US, you have the right to propose ballot questions at these AGMs. And these are rising very, very quickly. I'm going to look at a couple of them in a moment. In the past, they've really been a tool to produce an agenda of cleaner air, cleaner water, and so forth. But now, there's another point of view. And I think a good way to organize your thoughts around this is to go back to what is, arguably the most important essay in corporate governance, the famous paper in the early 1970s by Milton Friedman. I'm guessing that most of you know about this paper. Many of you have probably been assigned it or even read it for your classes. But this is Milton Friedman, of course, the great conservative economist from the University of Chicago. And he wrote an essay. It's published in all places in the Sunday New York Times Magazine. This is not in the Journal of Finance or the American Economic Review, but it ran in the Sunday Times. And the topic was the social responsibility of business. And he said, very simply and straightforward, the responsibility of business is to make money, to increase its profits, and leave it at that. And I think most social democratic societies think about the role of business really very differently, that you're supposed to also do good, do well, be nice to people, protect your customers, and so forth. And Friedman's point of view is really that you need to create the resources to do all these other things that you wish to do by having efficient, profitable businesses. And the essay is very well written. It's a little bit archaic. All the pronouns are male, for instance. I'm not sure he would have recognized today's business community with all the working from home and so forth. But nevertheless, this is a good thing to get the students going at the start of the course, to force them to come up with rebuttals, to think, what's he missing? And one thing, I actually do make them read it, and then we pick through some of the very important sentences. And the job of a corporate manager is to do what the shareholders want. And the shareholders typically invest to earn a rate of return. But he goes on to say, and this is the second bullet point, you should be conducting the business in accordance with their desires, they being the shareholders, which generally be to make as much money as possible while conforming to the basic rules of the society. And this is where things get a little tricky. What are the basic rules of society? You know, where do we look for those? Where do we find the limits on business? And Friedman goes on to identify two sources. One is the law. So, like, you can't employ children, you know, minimum wage, child labor laws. There are clear boundaries that you cannot cross, that if you could cross them, you might arguably make more money. So sometimes the legislature puts these down in writing, but often they are embodied in ethical custom. And the job of the manager, and this is really very difficult, is to figure out what is the ethical custom of the world I'm living in, and how might it have changed from 10 years ago. Now, the agenda of many corporations, to the extent that they've gotten input from the public and acted upon it, I've drawn this arrow pointing leftward because you can go down the checklist of protecting the environment, promoting different types of equality and race, gender, and more recently LGBTQ, promoting diversity, and pushing back against weapons of war, things that cause cancer, too much tobacco and alcohol that have all kinds of negative effects on society. You've had really decades of this activism, and it's always been something that corporate boards have been somewhat uncomfortable with. This is survey data this was produced by the Financial Times a couple of years ago. But they surveyed corporate directors both in the United States, which are the darker bars, and in this other country, ROW, rest of world, which just asking them to agree or disagree with these two statements, that a company is more than an economic unit. This is really exactly the opposite of what Milton Friedman was saying, and that it would be a fundamental change in capitalism to adopt the view of what's sometimes called stakeholder or ESG capitalism, to try to do more than to raise the share price. And you see that the American corporate directors, much less likely than international counterparts, to agree with this. The type of capitalism, in other words, in the United States, is much more in line with what Friedman would have said. And I don't want this to devolve into a law school lecture, but the duties of corporate directors in the U.S. are really pretty minimal. We have a concept called the duty of care, which can be reduced to the idea that you can't commit gross negligence. So it's okay, for instance, to sleep through a board meeting, because that's just simple negligence. Gross negligence is to get out and say, I don't care what people think, and storm out of the room and deliberately be misinformed. Now, look at what France has done on the bottom. They now have something called the duty of vigilance that is, as far as I can see, completely the opposite. If you're a director in France, the board has a proactive responsibility to make sure the company is not doing anything bad in these three categories: human rights and freedoms, health and safety, and the environment. So this is an affirmative duty for which you're legally accountable. If the company is exploiting human rights somewhere, you as a board member, can get into legal trouble. And I think the rest of the world is, very much, if not already there, moving in the direction of France and many other EU countries. But this is taking a lot of American companies out of their comfort zones. So a little bit of the history of these shareholder ballot initiatives. The United States began allowing this in the 1940s, and it was in response to two rich brothers who lived in New York during the Great Depression, and they were bored. They have nothing to do but go to shareholder meetings all day, which they began to attend the meetings that they invested in the stocks, and they were horrified that they couldn't speak. They couldn't be recognized from the floor. They, at one company, asked for a copy of the audit, the annual audit, and they were told that the audit was not something appropriate to allow the shareholders, the owners of the company, to see, and so forth. And so what they did was sue a company, Transamerica, and they got the regulator, the Securities and Exchange Commission, on their side. And in 1947, it's a very famous case in American law, a judge ruled that shareholders had the right to propose agenda items for the annual meeting, And from that point forward, it's been open season. Now, this is a classic case of a judge running wild. This was never passed by the Congress or even by the regulator. This is just a judge saying, this is what looks fair to me. And the rules for this, and we thank the Gilbert brothers for taking up this issue and establishing the principle, you just have to own $2,000 worth of stock, really a minimal amount of shares for 1 year. And there are activists who essentially will buy $2,000 in every company in the S&P 500 just to preserve for themselves the option of, when next year comes around, these are the 12 companies where I want to go disrupt. And you can propose a question within limits. It can't be too general. People have put questions up like, resolved warfare is always wrong. And they might send that to Boeing. And it's just much too vague. You can't also be too narrow. So you can't send a resolution to Coca-Cola and say, resolve the price of the Diet Coke at UWA should never be more than $2. It's just way too narrow. This is called ordinary business. So, in between those boundaries, you can propose almost anything you want. 99% of these have come from the political left. And these are some of the early ones. I think, very interestingly, Greyhound bus lines got one urging them to desegregate seating on the routes in the South where we had segregation, the Jim Crow laws. This was 4 years before Rosa Parks wouldn't go to the back of the bus. And so the leftist shareholders were on this issue very early. Ralph Nader with the auto safety, many resolutions coming in the 1970s. Anti-chemical weapons resolutions during the Vietnam era, and probably the greatest, I'm not sure success is the right word, but the greatest gathering of force behind a resolution would be the South Africa divestment movement that began in 1973, and ultimately it was successful in the sense that there was huge political change, but whether it was the tipping point of the shareholder involvement or not remains very controversial. But you can go down the checklist and recognize that these are all issues that would have ended up in the platform of the Democratic Party and would have been anathema to the Republicans. And most of the shareholders, of course, and most of the corporate directors were Republican, at least back in those days. And so the voting support for these was often pretty tepid. This is one of the more clever ones. We have the death penalty in the United States. We're one of the last civilized countries that still does. And it's only in certain of the 50 states, like not where I live in New Jersey, but in places like Oklahoma or Nebraska, for instance. So the way in which you can put people to death has to be not cruel and unusual. And so lethal injection has become the method that is used, I think, almost everywhere. And the shareholders went around to all the drug companies and proposed ballot questions that it's not a permissible use of the medications the company sells to sell them to state governments for executions. And so they indirectly were able to engineer, at least briefly, the ending of capital punishment in certain Midwestern states that were purchasing drugs. This was a completely backdoor channel of political protest that really tied up the Oklahoma and Nebraska legislatures for a period of time before they found some sort of workaround. Now, if you look at this, there are very hot political questions here that are not being addressed to the satisfaction of the shareholders through the normal political process. We have legislatures, we have an environmental protection agency. There are agreed upon ways that society should be addressing these, and it doesn't always come out the way that you want. And so what was really invented here was a second pathway, that if you're not happy with what Oklahoma has to say about capital punishment, let's just go to all the companies that have some connection to it and get them to agree by shareholder vote not to take part in this, and then get the outcome that you couldn't have gotten in the legislature. I think there's some very good lawyering here and lots of entrepreneurial activism. I got one more. This is nutrition at McDonald's. You can not only propose questions, but most companies have an informal, what's called a Q&A period or question time, where there's an open mic. And in this case, a 9-year-old girl who her mom brought to the meeting got to the microphone. Everyone said, how cute. And then she didn't even ask a question. She simply made a statement saying, it would be nice if you stopped trying to trick kids into wanting to eat your food all the time. And this, of course, would be the opposite of their business model. But the CEO decided to engage and very memorably said, we don't sell junk food at McDonald's. And nothing else that happened at the meeting that day mattered. I mean, this was like right in for the kill. He lasted about another 3 months. They let a polite interval of time go by, but he was out of a job. The video of this went viral and so forth. And it was the mom who was a nutrition activist who had bought the share that would get her in the door of the meeting and brought her kid. They were just completely unprepared and not expecting anything like this could happen. So in the last 2 years, and this is really very new to the point that there's not yet enough data for an academic study, although I'm certainly planning one. In the current season, there were 43 of these right-wing ballot questions. These are technically called shareholder proposals. And this was building off a very low base, but more than a 60% increase from the year before. In other words, these are coming out of the woodwork with increasing speed. The two most popular questions are, first of all, asking companies to divest their operations from communist China. And I'm not sure that the political left really disagrees that much, but they're clearly modeling this on what was done 50 years ago in South Africa by saying that the gang of people running the government in China are just as bad as the apartheid government in South Africa. And, we need to divest and cut all ties. The other one that has been, I think, much more divisive is asking companies to report on, I'm putting this in quotes, the victims of the diversity policies that they followed over the course of many years. In other words, to figure out how many white men were not promoted, how many Hispanics got jobs and then underperformed, and when they didn't hire Asian people. The whole narrative of the affirmative action debate that recently has been before the courts with university educations, now they're asking companies to go back and investigate and document this and bringing this up for a vote. I think these things will be voted down probably for the foreseeable future, but what we've seen from the political left is that if you bring these back 8, 10, 12 years in a row, eventually support builds and the door gets pushed down. So it's not that the left is absent from this, but for the first time there's really an opponent in the process who is trying to inflame the situation in the same way that the left has done very effectively. There are two groups with very bland, benign-sounding names. The National Center for Public Policy Research. What could be wrong with that? Watch out for these, though. These are, in disguise. These are the forces of evil. So here's the proposal. That they brought up at Starbucks, and I call this a Trojan horse, which is really a new thing in shareholder activism. The title is The Creation of a Board Committee on Corporate Sustainability. This sounds like it's from the left, right? And they say, resolve shareholders request the board create a committee on corporate sustainability to oversee and review the impact of the company's policy positions and advocacy on matters relating to the company's ongoing growth and sustainability. Okay, fine. This is something, in fact, you see many of these every year from the left asking companies to articulate their sustainability goals and so forth. You can put in a 500-word supporting statement, and if you read down, what this is really about is the bathroom policy at Starbucks. And the fact that they're letting homeless people come in off the streets and use the bathroom, and somebody must have been assaulted at one point, but they want to flag what, woke, Starbucks has embraced woke business practices, as you see. And I think a lot of people are going to simply vote for this based on the header, not realizing what they're voting for. And I'm not sure ultimately if this is the best strategy, that if you want to focus attention on this, you should be more open about it. But I expect this will probably get 20, 30%, like other sustainability resolutions typically get. And then the board's going to be in a little bit of an awkward position, trying to say this is not what people thought they were voting for. So, as a corporation, as a director, what do you do about this? And how do you address it? How do you oppose it? I'm not sure what the best practice is, but this is something that they just really haven't seen before. Now, I want to close with a couple results from a recent paper by Oliver Hart, David Thesmar, and Luigi Zingales. These are three of the more creative people working in finance and economics. And they went out and did a experimental study with 3,000 people who they chose at random to get their ideas about shareholder activism. And they begin by just trying to benchmark their sample. They ask two questions. One is, do you support the takeover of Twitter by Elon Musk, which is the y-axis? And on the left axis is, from 1 to 5, how strongly do you feel that if a company is doing business in Russia, it should exit Russia after the invasion of Ukraine? And so you can see there's almost perfect alignment that the people who support Elon don't want to get out of Russia. And as you feel more strongly about getting out of Russia, you are less and less excited about Elon Musk taking over Twitter and so forth. And it shows, first of all, that there are clear clienteles of shareholders. That there are people on the political right, these people up here, and there are people on the political left, and there's quite a few people in between. So they paid these people $3, which is customary in a experimental setting. You give in fact, for 3,000 people, someone gave them $9,000. They, in fact, could have written this check themselves, but they wanted people to take this seriously. And I think the answers to these questions about the Ukraine invasion, whether you should divest from Russia, are very interesting. So, for instance, based on whether you're conservative or liberal, the liberal people definitely want to get out of Russia more than the conservative people, but it's surprising to me that even 47% of the conservative people do. The cost to the company matters. So if you think it's going to do more damage to the stock price or to the bottom line, you're less and less likely to want to do the right thing, if you will, which means that there's a price on this, that people see this as an economic trade-off. They then asked everybody, do you want to donate 50 cents of your $3 to Ukraine? And many people actually said no. And then they asked them, based on whether you donated or didn't donate, do you still want to have the company do this? And even 51% of the people who wouldn't give the 50 cents still thought that the company should get out because it's probably going to cost them much more money indirectly, but it made them feel better to as a shareholder to express this view. In other words, they're looking really not for an economic outcome so much as an emotional one that made them feel better about being a stockholder of a good company. And some of these other results are also, rather interesting. Are you concerned about the war? Even 28% of the people who aren't concerned about the war still thought that you should get out, because there's some moral effect tied to it. And they had people hypothetically imagine that you're either an employee, a shareholder, or a customer of the company. Rather surprisingly, it was the customers who felt most strongly about this, but the difference among the three groups was not particularly large. You might have really thought that the shareholders, hypothetically, would have cared about this more than the customers. So I'm not sure what to read into this. I think it's entertaining the way they set up this study, but above all, it gets to the complexity that, there are many subgroups of shareholders. It's not all rich Republicans anymore. In fact, more money on the political left these days than on the political right in the US. And there's a complicated mix of cultural emotions and moral imperative and financial rates of return that I don't think companies have a good handle on. That the job of the corporate manager is much more complicated than it was even 5 years ago due to the entree of the political right. So there's a lot of, and at times thoughtful discussion about has the landscape shifted under the feet of corporate managers. And there is a school of thought that the political left has overreached. That when we hear about woke companies, you're you're asking for things like single or dual-sex bathrooms and gender transitions paid for by the shareholders, and things that would have been unimaginable in cultural discourse 10 or 20 years ago. I don't really sign up for this. I'm of the political left myself, but I don't think things have really changed that much that quickly, frankly, and that this is maybe an excuse and a warmed-over lament of the right wing. But I really don't think the political left has overplayed its hand. I think more they've taken the political right for granted. They thought this was one area that they sort of had a monopoly on, and that maybe the political right would try to engineer appointments to the Supreme Court and things like that, and you can have that, but this shareholder activism belongs to the left. I think I'll repeat what I started with. It's surprising to me that it took so long for the political right to get active in corporate democracy, but I think now they're here to stay. And I think undeniably everyone would probably agree that the circulation of information on social media plays a big role in this. That to facilitate communication among shareholders, among customers, and so forth, it can happen, in an afternoon, that everybody connected to the company can know about things that ordinarily you would have at least had to have subscribed to the Wall Street Journal and wait for the next day's newspaper and so forth, and it might have taken weeks to get the word out. But you need to react much more quickly, and when something controversial happens, you can more or less rely on the fact that by the time you've heard about it, everyone else already knows, and they expect you to act on it very quickly. And so I think the skills and talents of corporate managers and directors are going to be much more demanding and complicated than they were in the past generation and earlier than that. So let me stop, because we have some time for questions, and I welcome disagreement, further examples, and so forth. And I think we've set aside 15 or 20 minutes before we'll return then to the refreshments outside. So.
David, can I take my liberty as the director of the PPI? A lot of the anti-woke capitalism, if we look at it through a kind of a Hayekian lens, where Hayek talked about kind of the atomization of knowledge and the atomization of preferences, isn't this just markets doing what markets do best, essentially?
I kind of like that approach, and the thing that makes me a little uncomfortable is the importing of political agendas into corporate democracy when we already have one type of democracy to deal with this. But the U.S. opened the door to this, almost 75 years ago, I guess, and you are seeing a marketplace of ideas play itself out on the floor of shareholder meetings in a way that does probably inform the managers a little bit better about the preferences of the investors, the ultimate owners of the company, and that may not be a bad thing. Yes.
Hi, David. Thank you. And what, if any, will this add as criteria to boards on selecting board members, relevant experience, and senior management, CEOs?
I think, within the board, if you don't have a board that is politically diverse, it can be very risky. And I think this is probably part of what got Disney into trouble, for instance. We've been able to look at individual directors and who they donate to politically. So we've been doing this research for 15 or 20 years, where you can identify boards as Republican or democratically dominated. This is a board where half the people donated to Trump. Can you believe it? That kind of thing. And I think you need to have a mix of views and perspectives in the room. And the appointment of directors, I think this is equally true in Australia, is usually directors nominating their own friends, getting people who belong to the same clubs and play tennis with them and so forth. And I think it's really in the interest of shareholders. It's probably always been true that you want more diversity on the board. And you also want people who are politically skilled, whatever that means. And I'm not sure how you document the criteria for that. And I think CEOs and top corporate managers need to think of themselves as playing much more of a political role. That the view that I'm going to be Milton Friedman and make as much money as possible, maybe that's still correct, but the road to doing that goes through a lot of these political questions that you have to navigate with skill. You can't just, get some labor and capital and a production function. You need to be very thoughtful about the climate in which you're operating. And I think the backgrounds of managers may be less and less from business school MBA programs and more from the humanities, the political science. There's all kinds of backgrounds that might be important in the entertainment industry, just to pick one. So, it's going to be interesting to see how this evolves, but I don't expect the profile of corporate directors to resemble what it looked like 20 years ago. I think it's in for a lot of change.
David?
Yeah.
Thank you. You began your presentation speaking about freedom of speech and the ability for a society to tolerate divergence of views. But we see high-profile examples of companies committing to social issues, and we've had an example in the last few days of Qantas covering 3 of its jets in, vote yes to support the voice to Parliament, which has become a politically divisive issue, which, on current numbers would suggest that there isn't broad community support for, but we'll find that out soon. Where does that leave the employees, the pilots that have to fly that jet, the crew that work on that plane, if they don't personally agree with that view of the company?
Yeah, I had not heard of this example, and it's a very appropriate one for this discussion. You've heard similar questions about, people who are anti-war but are working for defense contractors, building missiles that are then launched, by Ukraine against Russia. It can get very, very complicated, but I think ultimately the matching of a worker in a company is probably going to have to account for the company's political culture. And I think companies should try to have a big tent would be optimal, so to rule out as few people as possible from wanting to work there. But there probably are issues that are morally imperative to take a stand on. And if this is important to Qantas, there's probably going to be some type of cost to them, and that pilots and baggage handlers don't want to work there. There's many other jobs to be had in this economy. But yeah, it's very complicated. It's a great example. Yeah.
We have a question, Lorraine?
Thanks, David. It was a great presentation. I had one question in regards to the numbers of right-leaning ballots. You said that in the past year it increased by something like 40%.
Yeah, 60%.
60%, considering it was from a low number before that. Do you foresee that increasing in such a rapid rate in the future?
I do. It's still a very small base, and they're getting so much traction and publicity out of this that it's going to become irresistible. You just have to buy a nominal amount of stock, and some people find this quite fun. And again, there have been these leftist gadflies who've done this for years to throw up bombs at the stage about equality, about clean air, and so forth. And the right is going to be doing this with guns and church and all the things that are important to them. So yeah, I expect to see much more of this. It's going to be probably more entertaining. Yes.
Thanks, David. So I want you to hazard an answer to your question up there. What took the right so long to get into this? What do you think?
I'm tempted to say that they didn't have the most clever people, but it's undeniable that they were successful through other political channels and social activism. And I think there may have been some complacency on the right in believing that ultimately all the boards of directors were rich, old Republican people. And we've seen a real shifting of the distribution of wealth in the technology economy, where most of the big entrepreneurs, people like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and so forth, they come from the political left. And for it's really the first time in American history, most of the big fortunes are held by people with liberal political beliefs, and they are now populating corporate boards and founding important companies. And I think there was some complacency that there was, guardrails in place that wouldn't let this stuff get out of control in the form of corporate directors. And there was a failure to perceive how the changing share ownership and the creation of new companies by leftist entrepreneurs really changed the distribution of wealth in the U.S. in an interesting way. So, I think, again, they've kind of come to recognize this and are now much more engaged in the system, but there probably was a period of delay and complacency where people were still thinking of, you know, the Bush Republicans as being in charge when that ship had sailed already.
Paul's got a question here, and then we've got one just over there. So, Paul, you first.
David, just following up on the question about the number of ballots, and I'm thinking about the kind of the geographies of this in a way, as a geographer. Will we see if we do see this increase in the number of ballots, is that likely to have an impact on firms deciding to move to locations where ballots are less likely? So obviously thinking of red and blue states or red and blue metropolitan regions.
It doesn't really matter where you're located if you're incorporated in the U.S. I think the concern would be either that you would reincorporate overseas, and there's a handful of firms that have registered in the Bahamas and places like that, or more likely that you would simply delist from the public markets and take the firm private. And this has been a very interesting trend that if you look at the data over 30 years, we had about 10 or 11,000 public companies in the U.S. 30 years ago. Today, there's only half that number. There's about 6,000. And many, many firms have been acquired by private equity and gone off of the markets. And in one form or another, it's the costs of regulation that is often cited for this. So this would be one more cost. You know, the fact that you have to open the meeting. I think Amazon had more than 20 ballot questions this year. You know, everything from labor practices to how you treat competing companies to worker safety, and you know, it's hard not to get trapped into writing an answer that could get you into legal trouble or, you know, lots of bad publicity. So my prediction, you know, would be that you would just see an acceleration of the exodus of companies from the public markets. That, you know, rather than look for more friendly shareholders, why not just have no shareholders at all? And it would put you very much back in a 19th century type of economy where firms are dark and less disclosure occurs and fewer people are calling the shot, you know, much less democratic and transparent. But I think, you know, this is the direction we've been moving for a long time, and you might well see it accelerate.
Excuse me.
Thanks. So my question was, do you see the legislature in the US trying to enter the field here and redefine the basic duties of the corporate governance model?
There definitely is interest in narrowing the rights of shareholder access. And, you know, there's a lot of detail I could go into, but when a new political administration comes in, they get control of the securities regulator. And we've had some back and forth between the Obama people and the Bush people who have either expanded or narrowed some of these issues of ballot access. So I would expect that that's going to continue. But I've always been surprised that this is judge-made law that has been allowed to stand, you know, essentially for 75 years and counting without Congress ever having a say on it. And it wouldn't surprise me if some omnibus bill went through the U.S. Congress or through the Delaware legislature at some point that greatly narrowed the participation of shareholders. You've seen that social media allows you to become informed and become engaged much more quickly at a lower cost, and the system really wasn't designed to accommodate that. So there's a school of thought that there's too much shareholder voting on too many questions now, and technology, I think, does play a big role in this, so it wouldn't surprise me to see some of this rolled back. But certainly this would be objected to by many people. It would not be a quick and clean fight. It would be a street fight, I think, you know, before that were actually enacted.
I think we have time for one more question.
Two
more questions. Okay, sorry, Ray. We'll take two.
So long in the companies. There's another question about universities. Like completely left dominated. What's taken the right so long in the universities?
Yeah, again, you know, I'm tempted to say.
So
you know, we have these conversations almost every day, and I don't have a good answer for this. You know, the people who are admitted to PhD programs and appointed to faculty jobs and so forth, you know, even in a field like finance, you know, 90% from the left or even more. And there is a certain contempt on the political right for scholarly activity and learning which I've always been offended by as a student and as an instructor, but I think they opt out for whatever reason. They don't get the PhDs, they don't pursue the faculty appointments, and so almost by default you have universities governed by leftist professors. But I don't know where that culture comes from, honestly. When I was a student in business school, if you made an intelligent comment that showed that you had done the work, you would be hissed at. And then George W. Bush became president, and we had this in the Oval Office. And I've always recoiled from this individually, but I don't know how it became such an institutional point of view to be proud of not having read books, which George Bush the father used to boast about. And maybe this caters to a certain voting dynamic. I don't know, but this is the culture that has excluded itself from academic leadership in my country, and I think it's regrettable because ultimately you narrow the marketplace of ideas.
I mean, it's an interesting question as well. If you start thinking about going to your point about having to have diversity at your board level, how do we, if we are attracting people from a certain demographic, then how do you, or certain political leaning, how do you guarantee diversity and not just get people that are, it's an interesting question. I think we've got time for one more. Over to you.
Thanks, I mean, before I ask the question, I think the differentiation between left and right is a bit more complex than what we've been saying, but anyway, that's okay. You mentioned before in one of your answers about bad for democracy if more companies went private, but isn't that the problem, that we try and suggest that corporations reflect democratic values and they're not democracies? Corporations are corporations. So isn't that the problem in the starting point?
Yeah, there are many points of view on this, and we had a CEO 20, 30 years ago in the U.S. named Chainsaw Al Dunlap, who was a ruthless cost cutter and focused, just as Milton Friedman would have loved, right on the bottom line. And he once said in a media interview, a corporation is not a social experience. Anyone who doesn't like what I'm doing, is free to go with the other 10,000 who I already fired and so forth. And the shareholders did very well with Chainsaw Al, but he was, in many ways oversimplifying. He had to engage with unions, he had to worry about worker safety. There were many boundaries that were set in a minimal way by the legislature, but the company had the opportunity to do better than the minimum. And there was an interest in that from not only the employees, but the customers, the shareholders, and so forth. I think, it's a complicated area, and again, going back to Milton Friedman, say the role of business is just to make money, but right away he adds, subject to the ethical norms of the society, and right away you're into a type of quicksand that's a little bit difficult to escape from, to say the least.
Yeah, thanks so much. I suppose the other question then is, what happens to increasingly difficult in a polarised society for a CEO to take the middle road? Has there been many examples of CEOs not wanting to buy into the fight, and how have they fared?
I think every CEO wishes to do this, and to the extent that you can keep everyone happy in a way that suppresses dissent, it's very, very hard though. And I think corporations, to the extent that they grow big, they have these stakeholders that become very large tribes with points of view, that they expect Apple to have a certain editorial content that they put out, and to treat the workers in a certain way, and to accommodate maternity leave and plan for people's retirement. All kinds of things that would make, sometimes political left, sometimes political right happy, but it's you are a quasi-political institution, like it or not. It's very hard to thread the needle and find the middle ground. And there are CEOs who you can point to who have sailed through and done this, but I think often they've just been in the right place at the right time, and more lucky than smart, perhaps.
Paul, do you want to bring it to a close, or?
Yeah, I think enough questions have been asked. We can have a mixer, and we can chat to David directly if we want to do that. Yeah, I think we should wrap up.
Just please join us thanking David for his time.
Make a couple of quick announcements about things. I just double check my list. So thank you very much, David.
All right.
And first of all, again, thanks to James for hosting us here at Forrest Hall. And hopefully this will be the start of a productive relationship between the PPI and Forrest Hall in our Policy Taboo series. kind of moving forward. Just want to kind of announce a couple of other events that we've got coming up pretty soon. So on the 30th of August, if I get the date right, we have our the Voice of Parliament event coming up. It's both in person and online. The in person is sold out basically, although it's a free event. But it's booked out, I should maybe say. So we've got about 350 people coming in person, and we're up to around about 250 online, or is it going beyond that?
Something like that.
Somewhere around that there. So if you want to join us for that there, it's looking at the constitutional legal aspects of the voice. You can join online, and you come to the PPI website, we can give you the information, or you can scan. We've got QR codes at the front as well, you can get information there. So thanks to Miriam and Claire for arranging all of that. And then we also have our Upkept Children in Detention event coming up as well, where we've got a Breakfast by the Bay panel event looking at kind of the policy implications and challenges and ways forward with dealing with children in detention as well. And again, the QR flyers or codes are out there. If you want to kind of scan those, you can find more information. And just again, thank you for coming to our inaugural Policy Taboo event seminar. And keep your eyes and ears open. There'll be more coming up. We've got a number of exciting topics coming up that we've got planned in our head over the next few months and going into next year as well. So thank you very much for coming out tonight. Big round of applause to you as well. And now we can socially mix.